Okay, so democracy, freedom, and the beginnings of Black Freemasonry. To the far right, you have the title page for David Walker's appeal. I'll talk a little bit about that. In the center, I am not a man. Am I not a man and a brother? This becomes an important rhetoric in movements to end slavery, and this becomes an important image. To the far left, you have to the bottom Crispus Attucks, and then you have this print. You probably can't read it, but it's from a newspaper making reference to Primus Hall, the son of Prince Hall. And then, in fact, you have Prince Hall's tombstone, the upper right-hand corner from Copp's burying ground, Copp's Hill in Boston. And then there is a microfilm copy of a roll of some of the first initiates of African Lodge number 1. I don't have access to the original, but I do have access to the microfilm. So forgive that very poor copy, but that is in fact a copy. And the originals, so the microfilm is held by the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts in Boston. And as I understand, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge also have the originals, which I have not seen yet. So a little bit about me. I am an historian of early American history, and I work in a religious studies department. I won't say a lot about the religious studies part of who I am. Suffice it to say, religious studies is an interdisciplinary department. It's interested in issues of ritual. That means something to this group today, I think. And also the meaning of history. So I slot into that very well. What do I do? Obviously, I work on Prince Hall Freemasonry. What attracted me to Prince Hall Freemasonry? I have to admit, it was not the rich and copious literature on secret societies and the like. That's obviously, there's a lot, right, that one can read and become very immersed in. That's not what attracted me. There are many people who, whatever they know about Freemasonry, they read various things and they think, oh, it must be the Illuminati or this grand kind of a thing. And that's not what attracted me, and so that literature is kind of what it is. I was attracted, though, by finding mention of Prince Hall throughout all these different historical records. All these historians talked about Prince Hall. And they all gave very interesting tidbits of information, but very few of them gave us a lot of significant and rich detail. And so I began to do research within the work of Masonic historians themselves. And Martin Robinson Delaney wrote in The Origin and Objects of Ancient Freemasonry. He gives a kind of a broad overview of Freemasonry's early origins. And moving on from him, we have other important Masonic historians, Grimshaw, who do a really good job of giving the broad outlines of Prince Hall Freemasonry. At the same time, they generate some themes, stories, ideas in Prince Hall Freemasonry that other scholars going forward have found to lack particular evidence. So, for example, the idea that Prince Hall came from the Caribbean. That's an interesting theory, but as of yet, there's no evidence that, in fact, that has been the case. In addition to Grimshaw, going forward, there are more recent scholars, Charles Wesley, Joseph Welks, and Harry E. Davis, who have all made significant contributions to understanding the history of Prince Hall Freemasonry. And at the same time, much of their work has been devoted to issues of legitimacy and of expansion within the lodge. And while a lot of their work makes reference to broader issues and themes in the history of North America, and particularly in the history of the United States, a lot of that broader context is left out of their work. And so here we are today. The scholarship on Prince Hall Freemasonry is expanding. Some really good stuff has been done by scholars who take a broad a variety of approaches. So Joanna Brooks, for example, writes about the texts that the earliest Prince Hall Freemasons produced, and she locates the thought of Prince Hall Freemasonry within these broader intellectual themes. Her argument is that the lodge is a secret space, a safe space, a secure space for African Americans, a particular group of African Americans, to understand themselves and to begin to create community within a larger American republic. The work by John Ernst, he coins this term liberation historiography, where he talks about the importance of not just tradition, but also of history within Prince Hall Freemasonry, and that this is a living history. And so he also deals with these texts to draw out arguments about how the earliest Prince Hall Freemasons, Prince Hall himself, are engaging in fact, a project of trying to understand Freemasonry's broader history and trying to locate African Americans and people of African descent within that history. So the work of literary scholars has been very important. In addition, we have the work of sociologists, Theda Skocpol, Corey Walker. I know some of you, in fact, know some of these works. David, you mentioned Bowling Alone, and so there's this argument that associational life in American society it has been on the decline since World War II, and that previous studies of this associational life, and this now is Skocpol's argument, that those studies of associational life have left out the voluntary associations of African Americans and other significant groups. And she asks this question about how do we understand the nature of voluntary associations in American history when we include those groups in that kind of a history. And then Corey Walker, who is in fact a Freemason, has written this book from what I would think of as a kind of cultural studies perspective. It's an interdisciplinary approach, blending history, blending cultural studies, and he uses this term, the Freemasonry of the race, to talk about Prince Hall Freemasonry really as a way to create a leadership class amongst African Americans. Then we also have the work of historians, Stephen Kantrowitz and Peter Hinks, who both situate Prince Hall Freemasonry in the 1800s or the 19th century. Their work is relatively recent. It's very significant. My work is positioned relative to their work in terms of chronology. So my work begins with Prince Hall, and it extends up to David Walker. These are what I call the first and second generations, in fact, of Prince Hall Freemasonry. There are other important works that do situate Prince Hall Freemasonry within a broader American context. Stephen Bullock, in fact, has been here before. The book All Men Free and Brethren, Nathan had mentioned, and then there's also this work by Mark Tabbert. This work is by no means exhaustive, but I wanted to give you a sense, in fact, of the vitality of current work in Freemasonry generally, and in Prince Hall Freemasonry that in fact is being done by historians, okay? So you not only have the work of Masonic historians, which talks about ritual, it talks about legitimacy, it talks about community. You also, in fact, have the work of academic historians who are building upon that work, I think, in important ways, and trying to understand Freemasonry in these broader contexts. I want to talk more about my own project today. And my argument builds on previous work that's been done, but it also moves beyond current descriptions of Black Freemasonry's origins. Now, to be clear, when I use that term, Black Freemasonry or African American Freemasonry, I'm making reference, in fact, to a history that has created, to be frank, a kind of racial divide. But I am not talking about two different kinds of Freemasonry, so we can be clear about that. Certainly, Prince Hall Freemasonry takes up the name of its founder, so it has this eponymous title, Prince Hall Freemasonry. But to be clear, when I use African American Freemasonry or Black Freemasonry, I'm talking about the same rites, rituals, associational forms, but I am also making reference to a particular racial history that has created two different groups. And it's precisely this history that I want to talk a little bit about today, and I think it's also speaks to some of the members in the audience who have been instrumental for conversations between these two groups, and some of you who are here. I thank you for that work, and I also, again, thank you for coming. So not only do the origins of Black Freemasonry reveal the complex fashioning of African American leadership, identity, and community, its beginnings reflect the problems and possibility of democracy in America and in a North Atlantic world during what historians have called the Age of Revolutions. And so on the screen, I have some key ideas that generated this age of revolutions, this idea of human equality, these ideas of inalienable natural rights. Those ideas are encapsulated and expressed in both the statements from the American War of Rebellion and then the French Revolution. Rather than focus on Black Freemasonry's early institutional development or focus particularly on issues of ritual, I want to illustrate its wider significance by tracing a line of its political activism from its founder, Prince Hall, to perhaps its most radical voice, David Walker, the writer of the famous Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. This was an excoriating polemic that unsparingly critiqued the colonization of African Americans, Thomas Jefferson's racism, and the expansion of slavery in the southern United States. Charting political activism from Hall to Walker is important for several reasons, and I want to emphasize 2 of those reasons. While historians acknowledge this timeline from Hall to Walker, they have done little to explore its political dimensions. And second, scholars have not fully appreciated the effects of David Walker's radicalism on the development of Prince Hall Freemasonry in the early 19th century. So together, the American War of Rebellion, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Slave Revolt comprise the Age of Revolutions. Prince Hall emerged as a distinctive leader and an important public voice during this period. In different but related ways, each of these politically transformative events displaced thousands of slaves and affected greater mobility among masterless men of European and African descent. Blacks declared that they too possessed natural rights and that God made them equal to whites. Slaves escaped their masters, petitioned imperial governments, created maroon societies, and formed racially separate social and religious organizations. Migrants connected distant Black populations by spreading news and rumor. Throughout these periods of social and political upheaval, Blacks agitated for freedom and equality in a variety of ways that, however divergent, did not merge inevitably at one organic racial or cultural axis. Black Freemasonry, Prince Hall Freemasonry, is one of these axes. Instead, the new mobility in politics ushered in by war and upheaval only increased the number of pathways sought out by Boston Blacks in their search for work and for freedom. And so here is just a map describing the transatlantic slave trade. So one can begin to visualize the transatlantic world. I think that Prince Hall was imagining as he in fact joined the lodge. So given that Prince Hall Freemasonry begins in Boston, I think it's safe to say that Black Freemasonry's beginnings were an outgrowth of a Black cosmopolitan consciousness illustrated by a kind of racial and cultural imperative and by a recognition that mobility mattered. And this begins to give us a sense of that mobility. And that the process of emancipation took place in local and regional and also in international contexts. African American Freemasonry was a mechanism of community and politics that shaped and was shaped by histories of race, slavery, and freedom. Black Freemasonry and its transatlantic political outlook emerged from the politics of abolition and from patterns of travel produced by gradual emancipation. The example of Prince Hall makes this point. As the 13 English colonies south of the province of Quebec united in complaint against Great Britain, an officer in the British Army initiated Prince Hall and 14 other men of color into the first unofficial lodge comprised solely of black men, African Lodge Number 1. And there's certainly controversy about the particular origination date, and during questions and answers, perhaps somebody might ask a question about that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now, though. Hall orchestrated the creation of this first black lodge, recognized by the Grand Lodge in London, African Lodge Number 459. In 1784, Hall, after maintaining a correspondence with English Freemasons and relying upon both black and white seamen, conveyed a request to the Grand Lodge of London for a charter that would formally recognize African Lodge. Again, utilizing a network of sailors, Hall received the official document in 1787. That brief narrative should be familiar to those of you who are expert in the early history of Prince Hall Freemasonry. Although Hall's biography remains obscure, he came of age in the tumultuous late 18th century. Before the end of the colonial rebellion, in 1777, Hall and others petitioned the Massachusetts legislature demanding the end of slavery in the Bay State. 9 years later, November 26, 1786, Hall wrote to the governor of Massachusetts, James Bowdoin, pledging the support of the Black Masons to any state-supported efforts against Shays' rebellion. This was an insurrection of poor farmers in western Massachusetts led by Daniel Shays, a patriot veteran soldier who had in fact fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. 1787 also marked a year when Hall and approximately 72 others applied to the Massachusetts General Court with a plan to emigrate to Africa. And when Hall and 34 other men wrote to the Boston Selectmen, it was to gain support for the education of black children in the city. The next year, in 1788, Hall successfully complained in New England newspapers about the kidnapping of 3 blacks from Boston, one of whom, in fact, was a Masonic brother. The following year, he organized a talk for the Black Methodist itinerant preacher, John Morant, and then in 1792 and 1797, Prince Hall himself gives 2 published speeches for the African Lodge there in Boston. Whites also acknowledged Hall's authority. The prominent Boston minister, Jeremy Belknap, when writing about the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts, interviewed Hall as a representative voice of former bondspeople. The Salem minister and Freemason, William Bentley, also acknowledged the status of Hall, and during the summer of 1801, only 6 years after Hall's death, Bentley recalled a banquet of importance where, quote, where he stated, quote, our chief cook was Prince Hall, an African and a person of great influence upon his color in Boston, being master of the African Lodge, and a person to whom they refer with confidence their principal affairs, end quote. During the dinner, the Reverend James Freeman of the Episcopal Stone Chapel in Boston remembered Hall, quote, as a, quote, a very useful man, end quote, and bestowing ironic praise upon Hall. Freeman also remembered or described, quote, the Masonic Negroes are evidently many grades above the common blacks of Boston. So there's this issue of status there that maybe we can talk about later. The enlistment of Hall in any of the various kinds of patriot forces remains unverifiable. However, Boston tax records shed some light on his biography and social environment. And this gets back to my entree into the world of Prince Hall. When I went looking for him in Boston, I tried to uncover more biographical facts than had already been outlined and detailed by Masonic scholars. I found very little new information, and so kind of scratched my head, working on my dissertation, where do I go from here? And so what I did is I thought maybe I could open up the world in which Prince Hall lived. So I went through 20 years of Boston tax records that took about a year and compiled a database of approximately 1,100 different individuals between 1780 and 1801 who were identified in Boston tax records as persons of color, and they're described as being black or Negro or mulatto. Town assessors were not comprehensive in their recording of blacks from year to year. However, there are many cases where the records make it possible to track the same person across time. And so here, in fact, you have a picture of a taking book. This one's from 1800. Boston, by 1800, was divided into 12 wards. Each ward had a particular individual who was responsible for going around trying to identify the people who lived there and who could be taxed. This, in fact, and forgive me, I don't have a picture. I couldn't readily find a picture where I'd taken a picture of Prince Hall being described. But this, in fact, once you open up the taking book, this is what you find. And if you count down, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you'll see James Lower, and you'll see BLK, black, and then you'll see a 1 by him, which meant that it was just him. And then you keep on moving over, and then you see servant to ditto, and so above him you see Thomas and George Payne. That was not the Thomas Paine of either fame or ill repute, and so you see these kinds of entries throughout these 20 years of the taking books. Another example here. If you look down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you'll see, or 7, you'll see William Pierre and Boston Ballard, again described as black, and then ditto. And then you'll see the 1 for each of them, and that's in the poll column. And the poll essentially was a term, at the very top too, Jack Williams, black. So the poll just described the number of people who could be taxed, 1 poll, 2 polls. And then you can read the description, 1 room served. So a bit about Boston Ballard, and if I can go back to this. Boston Ballard served with Jonathan Loring Austin, a rope maker in Ward 6 from 1790 to 1792. However, in 1792, the assessor also noted that Ballard had, quote, gone. The next year, another Boston Ballard, who might have been the same individual, but perhaps a different individual, began working for Dr. William Spooner in Ward 7. This Ballard is the same one that you just saw. And he's listed with Dr. Spooner from 1793 to 1801, except for 1795. And so I put up went back to the map of the Atlantic world just to highlight this issue of mobility. As a consequence of the American Revolution, it varied, but all of the states essentially north of New Jersey began to free their slaves. And so this is great. But it also means that these slaves have to root themselves somewhere. They have to possibly make a living somewhere. They want to start families. They want to maintain a stable life. So being freed from slavery didn't necessarily guarantee any of those other things necessary to carry on a kind of domestic life. And so one of the things that the taking books are really useful for is tracking the degree of mobility amongst all of these newly freed people. And they are moving. In the context of this movement, one of the things that stands out is the continuous residency of Prince Hall. I find him in 15 years of these taking books. So not only do the records demonstrate him as this pillar of community in a sea of flux and mobility amongst African Americans, they also, I think, help to situate the emergence of the African Lodge in Boston. It becomes a way of being plugged into this mobility in the broader Atlantic world, but it also begins to situate a particular group of people of African descent in Boston. Continuing on with Prince Hall, his enlistment, it's clear that he made drum heads. We have evidence of this for the Army. There were, in fact, several princes identified in these tax records. Assessors identified 2 Prince Halls, in fact, but one of those is listed as being dead in 1785. And the records also describe the Masonic Prince Hall as, quote, Freemason, end quote, quote, worshipful Grand Master, end quote, quote, Master Mason, end quote, quote, Black Freemason and Master of Lodge, end quote. And they also described him, in fact, as a leather dresser, which then corroborates him making drums for the Patriot Army. So not only do tax records partially illuminate Prince Hall's social worlds in Boston, they also reveal the significance of mobility and transiency in shaping Hall's worldliness. As I mentioned earlier, we have no evidence that he arrived to Boston from the Caribbean, but certainly once he arrived at Boston, he remained rooted there. Despite remaining rooted in Boston, he develops international reputation and a significance that certainly spreads out and helps lead to him forming this lodge in Boston. And so, in addition to the possibility of military service, there's another important way to link Hall into this revolutionary moment for the 13 colonies. And so here I'm going to move a little bit away from him and talk about some other important individuals who are critical to understanding Prince Hall's origins, Prince Hall's Freemasonry's origins. January 1773, a person of African descent by the name of Felix wrote an anti-slavery petition to the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Province. So this was obviously before the War of Rebellion. This first letter was signed by an individual named Felix, and it's likely that he had help from whites in writing and sending this letter. And in this missive, Felix exclaimed, as you see up here, quote, "We have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country." 4 months later, Felix sent another petition, and this time he included his last name, Holbrook. Historians have already emphasized the importance of these critiques for thinking about a history of abolition. However, they are useful for us because they help us follow the relationship between activism and Black Masonry. So following this second petition that was written in April of 1773 came 5 others. The second petition, dated April 1773, not only included the signature of Felix Holbrook, but it also included that of others, including Peter Bestes, who in fact later became one of the original 15 initiates of African Lodge. Holbrook disappears from the public except for mention of a Felix Holbrook, a Black, being admitted to the Boston Almshouse. It was essentially a public institution that took care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. Felix Holbrook, a Black, is admitted there in 1792. Bestes not only helped draft this 1773 petition, but he also helped draft the petition of January 1777 that was authored also by Prince Hall. Bestes himself dies June 20th, 1778, as described in Masonic records. In addition, Lancaster Hill becomes a Freemason sometime after 1775, but also signed this January 1777 petition. By June 23rd, 1779, Hill had attained the degree of master and he had become treasurer of the African Lodge. And then the most important of his first generation, Prince Hall, as I mentioned, also signed this 1777 petition. Hall's correspondence with the Grand Lodge in London led to this first group receiving its official charter and eventually entering into the Grand Lodge registers as African Lodge number 459. Hall's reputation led the African American itinerant preacher John Morant to seek him out when Morant himself arrived to Boston from Nova Scotia in early 1789. The story of Morant is a very interesting one. He leaves the colonies with the British. He arrives to Nova Scotia. He spends some time there. He spends some time in Great Britain, where he meets the Countess of Huntingdon, comes back, and eventually arrives to Boston, where he's made a member of African Lodge. The 7 petitions written in this 4-year span became increasingly impatient and strident in tone. The language here, as written by Felix and also Bestes, was a language that was determined, but it was also language that was deferential. Okay? So it's making a critique, but it's not making that critique too strongly. The language of the petitions moves from being conciliatory to being somewhat sarcastic and, in fact, demanding. The language of the 1777 petition expressed the impatience of earlier petitions and explicitly critiqued colonial hypocrisy. Addressing the Massachusetts General Court, Hall and the other writers noted, quote, "Your Honor need not to be informed that a life of slavery like that of your petitioners, end quote, who were, quote, deprived of every social privilege, of everything requisite to render life tolerable," end quote. And that this burden of slavery represented a circumstance, quote, far worse than non-existent, end quote. This sarcasm differed markedly from the differential tone of previous appeals. Sometime after the war and after Massachusetts had ended slavery, the esteemed Jeremy Belknap asked for Hall's thoughts regarding the processes and consequences of emancipation in Massachusetts. Belknap quoted Hall, so this is Belknap quoting Hall. This is not directly from Hall, but Belknap is saying this is what Hall said, stating that, quote, "Harmony in a great measure prevails between us as citizens, for the good law of the land does oblige everyone to live peaceably with all his fellow citizens, let them be black or white. For we stand on a level, therefore no preeminence can be claimed on either side," end quote. The Masonic metaphor of standing, quote, on a level stands out in Hall's language. This seemingly minor and inconsequential phrase shows that the universalism espoused within Freemasonry meant more to Hall than just a rhetoric of equality. Hall deployed the metaphors and idioms of Freemasonry in explaining everyday life. According to Belknap, Hall further explained, however, that, quote, "There is a great number of worthy, good men and good citizens that are not ashamed to take an African by the hand, but," Hall demurred, quote, "yet there are to be seen the weeds of pride, envy, tyranny, and scorn in this garden of peace, liberty, and equality." So that can be read, I think, 2 ways. Perhaps talking about tensions within the lodge, but given the question that was asked to Hall about this broader process of abolition, I read that quote as Hall, on the one hand, talking about this opportunity of equality, but then or I should say the opportunities granted by freedom, but then also making reference to the fact that freedom did not necessarily convey equality. Willing to support the state against Shays' Rebellion in 1786, I think, demonstrated Hall's pragmatic activism. And his pragmatic activism, as we move forward, I will compare and contrast with the activism of David Walker, also a Freemason. So from his initiation into Freemasonry to his death in 1807, Hall explored different paths to freedom and equality. These paths included Freemasonry, public campaigning, and supporting the newly formed Massachusetts state. Although Hall's leadership helped to establish the African Lodge, his death in 1807 also represented the passing of a generation. If Hall is symbolic of a first generation, then David Walker, despite his untimely death in 1829, was the most, 1830, was the most public voice of Black Freemasonry's second generation. And there is Walker's appeal. So scholars have noted Walker's membership in the African Lodge. However, they have not written a history of African American Freemasonry that begins with Hall and then leads to Walker. Walker's time in Boston, 6 years, was short, but deeply and broadly impactful. According to his biographer, Peter Hinks, Walker reached Boston from Charleston, South Carolina, no later than 1824. However, Walker died soon after in 1830. The causes of his death still are not completely verified. Much of Walker's origins lie in obscurity. A 19th century source dated Walker's birth to be September 28th, 1785 in Wilmington, North Carolina, the son of a free mother and an enslaved father, which made David Walker free. However, his death notice in Boston noted his final age as 31. Either way, he arrives to Boston, in fact, as a second generation, somebody who's young in his life. There are two different views of David Walker. Patrick Rail's examination of antebellum Northern Black activism suggests that it was the North that allowed Walker to have the public voice that he had and amplified that voice. But in interesting contrast, Peter Hinks argues that Walker brings his Southern experience to the North, and in that way has this significant impact on the African Lodge. I think these interpretations are more complementary than conflicting. I think both are true. I think Walker and his direct experience with the violence of slavery in the North brings that information with him to Boston. At the same time, by 1830, Prince Hall Freemasonry in Boston and in other cities like Providence, like Philadelphia, like New York, has matured to the degree, I think, where African Americans are able to exert a fairly important public voice. And so Walker arrives to Boston as somebody who's free, as somebody who's literate. He soon established himself as a used clothing dealer, and this was a business that had become increasingly lucrative and that was thought to reflect some degree of respectability for African Americans. Walker soon thereafter joins the African Lodge and the semi-independent and autonomous Black Methodist May Street Church. Peter Hinks noted that the clothing trade and Freemasonry provided Walker with many of his most important Boston relationships. In addition, Walker, along with the Reverend Thomas Paul, served as the agents, the Boston agents, for the distribution of Freedom's Journal. Paul founded Boston's first Black church, the African Baptist Church. Paul himself enters into the African Lodge sometime before 1821 and serves as its chaplain. And records indicate that sometime thereafter he becomes Master Mason. And so Paul and Walker are linked not only through their membership in the Lodge, but as agents of Freedom's Journal. Freedom's Journal is important because it was the first African-American owned newspaper in the United States. So it started in 1827, and again, I think it's a measure of the degree of maturation of this second generation of free African-Americans in the North and even of Prince Hall Freemasonry in the North. Given Walker's initiation into African Lodge, it's likely that he read the 3 published texts that first articulated ideas of Freemasonry as understood by people of African descent. And so these were produced by John Morant in 1789 and then by Prince Hall in 1792 and 1797, and delivered to the African Lodge there in the city. I think there are aspects of Walker's appeal that echo certain broad concerns of Black Freemasonry. The writing of Morant and Hall argued that the founding of African Lodge in Boston was providential because it renewed a sacred history wherein the earliest Freemasons were biblical hewers of stone who not only lived in Africa, but also helped to build and lead the first Jewish and Christian civilizations. So this is the reading that Prince Hall and John Morant are giving to texts, for example, that are produced in Great Britain in the early 18th century. And it's these proof texts of Prince Hall Freemasonry that emphasized Christianity, benevolence, literacy, and Enlightenment ideas of universal brotherhood. A concern for education and the emphatic featuring of Black intelligence, I think concerns for all Freemasons, wove through the writing of both Hall and Walker. Not only had Hall petitioned for the public funding of schools for Black children, his 1797 address to the African Lodge praised Black intellect, even in the absence of formal education. Highlighting the intellectual abilities of Black people, Hall explained that, quote, although you are deprived of the means of education, yet you are not deprived of the means of mediations, by which I mean thinking, hearing, and weighing matters, men and things in your own mind, and making that judgment of them as you think reasonable to satisfy your minds and give an answer to those who may ask you a question. Hall was directly refuting the racist presumption that people of African descent did not have the mental capacity to be Freemasons, to learn and explain the system of symbols, metaphors, and rituals that comprised fundamental Masonic knowledge. Hall further affirmed Black intelligence when he wrote, quote, let those despisers see, although many of us cannot read, yet by our searches and researches into men and things, we have supplied that defect. And if they will let us, we shall call ourselves a chartered lodge of just and lawful Masons. This comes from his 1797 address. Hall essentially illustrates that African American Freemasonry was an argument for Black equality. Certainly, many African Americans desired literacy beyond just the Freemasons. Yet, for Freemasons of color, their identity as Masons made education, I think, an even greater necessity. Like Hall, David Walker saw education as an urgent requirement, and he expressly dignified the acumen of Black people. Although scholars acknowledge that Walker was a Freemason, very little analysis explains how the African Lodge and its tradition of activism might have informed and impacted Walker's politics as expressed in his famous Walker's Appeal. So echoing Hall without mentioning Masonry, Walker explained that, quote, I know well that there are some talents and learning among the colored people of this country which we have not had a chance to develop in consequence of oppression, but our oppression ought not to hinder us from acquiring all we can. It seemed that Walker was explaining the responsibility of his Masonic brethren the responsibility of his Masonic brethren when he wrote, quote, men of color who are also of sense, for you particularly is my appeal designed, and that's this appeal. Our more ignorant brethren are not able to penetrate its value. I call upon you, therefore, to cast your eyes upon the wretchedness of your brethren and to do your utmost to enlighten them. Go to work and enlighten your brethren. Let the Lord see you doing what you can to rescue them and yourselves from degradation. In addition, Walker fiercely challenged those who questioned Black intelligence. On this score, Walker called out none other than Thomas Jefferson. In Walker's third edition, he quoted Jefferson, who wrote, quote, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. Walker made sure, in fact, to cite Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, where this quote came from. And Jefferson's notes went through various editions before being first published in Paris in 1785, and then the English edition comes out in 1787. And so the stakes were high before this debate about black intelligence. And unfortunately, they have remained high, I would argue, even to this day. It makes sense that Walker took on Jefferson for the sake of human equality, but Walker also defended the legitimacy of the African Lodge. Jefferson's remarks illustrated the growth of what historians have called scientific racism. Over the course of the 19th century, even as secularization challenged biblical justifications of slavery and racial inferiority, newly emerging scientific or pseudo-scientific ideas identified racial difference as innate and immutable. Racial ideas changed, but in fact, they only became more pervasive and deeply rooted as they shaped and were shaped by new ways of understanding nature. Jefferson's influence was not lost on Walker. Regarding Jefferson, Walker asked, quote, "Do you believe that the assertions of such a man will pass away into oblivion unobserved by this people and the world?" And Walker continued, quote, "If you do, you are much mistaken. See how the American people treat us. Have we souls in our bodies?" And so the quote that you have here is also from Jefferson on his notes of the state of Virginia. And it's making reference to Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first published person of African descent, the first female of African descent, forgive me, in the Anglo-Atlantic world. She was owned by the Wheatley family of Boston. She writes a series of poems that she's able to sell. However, she died destitute in Boston. She lies at the center of this debate about black intelligence. You can find copies of her collections of poems, and you'll find at the very beginning of that a very long list of benefactors. That list of benefactors played a rhetorical role in that document. It was an argument that, in fact, her poems were legitimate, they were authentic, and in fact, they were this rhetorical argument for African American equality. Okay? And somebody like Jefferson was actually sent her poems, and in response, Jefferson essentially says, yes, you know, religion has produced a Wheatley, but really, you know, she's a good mimic, essentially. That her poetry doesn't represent any kind of black intelligence or black genius. It makes sense that Walker took on Jefferson. Walker continued a tradition amongst black Freemasons of protesting against slavery that in many ways was started by Prince Hall. At the same time, he moved from deferential and pragmatic languages of earlier critiques. So in the petitions that I mentioned earlier, even though Prince Hall's tone becomes more demanding, I think we can draw some interesting contrasts between the tone of Hall and the tone of Walker, and I think this then raises interesting questions about how the tone of Prince Hall Freemasonry changes in its response to issues of racism and slavery. This shift also mirrored a broader transformation where abolitionists had pivoted from gradual strategies to ending slavery to calling for its immediate and uncompensated end. This eventually gets us to the Civil War, but I don't go that far today. David Walker frankly allowed that violence might be the only means, in fact, for moving toward a racially inclusive nation. When he declared, quote, "But I tell you, Americans, that unless you speedily alter your course, you and your country are gone," in exclamation marks. Walker continued, quote, "For God Almighty will tear up the very face of the earth. will not that very remarkable passage of Scripture be fulfilled on Christian Americans? Hear it, Americans. And here Walker quoted from the biblical book of Revelations, quote, "He that is unjust, let him be unjust still, and he which is filthy, let him be filthy still, and he that is righteous, let him be righteous still, and he that is holy, let him be holy here, be holy still." Walker did not mince words. His entire appeal opened up early remarks. Quote, "Our sufferings," speaking about black people, "our sufferings will come to an end in spite of all the Americans this side of eternity. Then we will want all the learning and talents among ourselves, and perhaps more to govern ourselves. Every dog must have its day. The Americans is coming to an end." Walker's powerful words reverberated among slave owners, but also black men and women. Walker recognized that he would be, quote, "held up to the public as an ignorant, impudent, and restless disturber of the public peace by such avaricious creatures," this is him talking, "as well as a mover of insubordination, and perhaps put in prison or to death for giving a superficial exposition of our miseries and of exposing tyrants." End quote. Yet Walker's stunning judgment of American society not only inspired others like Mariah Stewart, it also aligned with significant events in the history of Prince Hall Freemasonry. So Mariah W. Stewart, born Mariah Miller, was exceptional among early 19th century women, and especially black women, for her writing and public protest. She's one of, historians acknowledge her to be one of the first women, and certainly women of color, who take it upon themselves to speak candidly and frankly to audiences of men and audiences of women, which was not, was deeply frowned upon in the early 19th century. In her speeches and her printed work, Stewart protested the colonization movement and slavery. She argued for equal education, and she expressed deeply held feminist and Christian perspectives. As a Boston resident between 1831 and 1833, Mariah gave several public addresses and had several pamphlets published in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Stewart was married in the African Baptist Church by the black Mason Thomas Paul, who I mentioned earlier. Her husband's death and an evangelical conversion experience spurred her to begin publishing and public speaking. She wrote a piece in The Liberator where she noted being inspired by Walker. Quote, "God hath raised you up a Walker," end quote, she explained. And she echoed Walker's foreboding tone, warning that God, quote, "will not suffer you to quell the proud, fearless, and undaunted spirits of the Africans forever." At least 2 times at the African Lodge, Stewart addressed a general, this was the African Lodge in Boston, Stewart addressed a general audience, and on a separate occasion, again at the Lodge Hall, she spoke to the members of the African American Female Intelligence Society. In addition to lecturing at the Black Lodge in Boston, Stewart also addressed audiences at Franklin Hall, and this was an important site of meetings for the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Although Stewart left Boston while lamenting negative responses to her outspokenness, her activity also underscored the role of Prince Hall Freemasonry within a maturing black public sphere. And so if we can move to this black public sphere, and here I'm nearing an end. And forgive me that this is a document that you can't read very well. It's nice that these are big screens. You might barely be able to make out the very top line saying independence, proclaimed by the African, and it continues, Lodge. On June 18th, 1827, African Lodge number 459 in Boston formally declared itself an African Grand Lodge. This announcement came 12 years after Black Masons in Philadelphia had publicly already announced the formation of their own African Grand Lodge. And so that's an interesting story because Philadelphia, or Masonry is brought to Philadelphia by Prince Hall Freemasons in Boston, but then at a certain point, Masons in Philadelphia create their own Grand Lodge. Some other important dates relative to issues of timing. This Boston group changed itself approximately 3 years after David Walker had arrived to the city, 1 year before founding of Freedom's Journal, and 2 years before Walker printed his appeal. The declaration made clear that African Lodge number 459 was an, quote, African Grand Lodge, end quote, and that it had first been made into a lodge, quote, under charter given to our worthy brothers Prince Hall, Boston Smith, and Thomas Saunderson, colored brethren, by Lord Howard Earl of Effingham, acting Grand Master under the authority of His Royal Highness Henry Frederick Duke of Cumberland, and Grand Master of the most ancient and honorable society of free and accepted Masons. So even though they declare themselves to be a Grand Lodge, they also give note of their origins, essentially what would be their mother lodge in Great Britain. These writers further explained, quote, we assume and take upon ourselves the responsibility of declaring ourselves free from the government and control of our mother, the Grand Lodge of England, by whom our charter dated the 29th day of September, 1784, end quote. Furthermore, this announcement made it clear that this group would, quote, exercise the same power of other Grand Lodges, granting warrants and charters and establishing lodges among our brethren for the good of Masonry when they are found worthy, end quote. This declaration was a statement about Masonic maturity that also reflected competition amongst Black lodges. But it also served as a testament to their deservedness of political rights. This announcement was an attestation of American citizenship, less so because it marked a bureaucratic split from Great Britain, and more so because it demonstrated that people of color were worthy of national rights. In effect, the most respectable Black institution, the African Lodge, could govern itself. So to line these things up, there is this debate about the intelligence of Black people. If they're seen as innately inferior to whites in terms of their intelligence, well, that negates the logic of them being able to hold a lodge, even if it's underneath another lodge. So in many ways, their declaration of a Grand Lodge, I argue, was on the one hand in keeping with Masonic ideas, but it was also challenging the historical context of those ideas in making the argument that Black people deserved to be Masons on the same level with whites. So today my brief narrative has taken us from Prince Hall to David Walker, and it allows us to see how fundamental questions about the history of democracy arise from, in fact, a history of African American Freemasonry. Historians have acknowledged the significance of the first generation of Prince Hall Freemasons, yet there has not been a sustained analysis of the central and multiple roles played by Prince Hall Freemasonry in creating the ideological and institutional foundations for Northern Black civil society before 1830. My very brief outline of this story highlights the importance of Prince Hall Freemasonry in the histories of slavery, abolition, and democracy. As a Freemason, Walker was a member of a society that recognized itself as playing a central and crucial role in the development of American democracy. At the same time, Walker critiqued the fundamental racial terms, and I'll repeat that for emphasis. At the same time, Walker critiqued the fundamental racial terms on which American democracy developed. Walker and Prince Hall Freemasonry more broadly reflected what I think is a vexed and complicated relationship within American democracy. Walker castigated the basic racism within American democracy and called the United States, in fact, into question. Moreover, as a group, Black Freemasons embodied a challenge to the racist origins of American democracy, which in fact I think we see with Thomas Jefferson. At the same time, being a Freemason also demonstrated a significant investment in the symbols and structures of democratic society. And so, in addition, this fundamental question about democracy is related to and comprised of other important questions only hinted at in my talk today. And so, I think the further study of Prince Hall Freemasonry can begin to open up other important questions. For example, what were the complex politics that developed within and between Black institutions like fraternities and churches? And I think this question is highlighted in the work that Nathan is really doing and sounds really exciting. How did Freemasons of color absorb and express ideas about respectability? An idea I think that's central to notions of consensus and civil political participation within American democracy. And last, I could go on with this list, but I'll end with this one. How did public and institutional forms of Black masculinity develop and change at the turn of the 19th century? As I tell my students, that's all I got. Hopefully my remarks today have revealed the importance of Prince Hall Freemasonry for thinking about democracy and its related questions about the relationship between Masonic history, American history, and in fact, African American history. Thank you.